On paper, this shouldn't have been possible. The most visible rookie the WNBA had seen in years didn't get hurt, didn't miss practice, didn't violate any team rules, and yet she seemed to vanish overnight. One day, Caitlin Clark was the center of every broadcast, every headline, every sold-out arena. The next, her presence felt strangely muted, like someone had turned the volume down without telling anyone why. No dramatic announcement, no urgent update, just an absence that didn't fit the story fans had been watching unfold all season. What made it unsettling wasn't just that she wasn't featured the same way, it was how quietly it happened. No build-up, no explanation, her name wasn't highlighted, her role wasn't clarified. Questions were met with vague answers that sounded rehearsed but empty, the kind that raise more suspicion than they resolve. For a league that had spent months embracing the attention Clark brought, the sudden shift felt jarring, almost intentional. And once fans noticed, it was impossible to unsee. This wasn't a fringe player slipping through the cracks. This was the face drawing first-time viewers, the jersey kids were asking for, the reason casual fans suddenly knew WNBA tip-off times. Caitlin Clark wasn't just participating in the league's growth, she was driving it, which is why the silence around her sudden fade from the spotlight felt so loud. In professional sports, decisions usually come with narratives. Injuries have timelines, benchings have explanations, even controversial calls get defended. Here, there was nothing, just a blank space where clarity should have been. Naturally, that vacuum didn't stay empty for long. Fans started replaying recent games, interviews, sideline moments, looking for clues they might have missed. Reporters reread quotes that once felt harmless, social media filled with screenshots, clips, and side-by-side comparisons that asked the same question in 100 different ways. How does a league benefit from making its biggest draw harder to see? And more importantly, who thought this would go unnoticed? The strangest part was how quickly the tone changed. Coverage that once felt celebratory turned cautious. Praise softened, mentions became shorter, less enthusiastic, almost careful. It wasn't open criticism, it was something subtler, a shift that suggested someone, somewhere, wanted the temperature lowered. And for a fan base that had watched Caitlin Clark elevate the league's visibility in real time, that felt less like coincidence and more like a decision. No one was accusing anyone, at least not yet, but patterns don't need official confirmation to raise alarms. When success suddenly gets treated like a liability, people start asking uncomfortable questions. And as the league stayed quiet, those questions grew sharper, spreading far beyond Caitlin Clark herself. Because if this could happen to the player bringing unprecedented attention, what did that say about how power really works behind the scenes? And that's where this story truly begins, not with a stat line or a box score, but with a disappearance that made no sense and a silence that only made it harder to ignore what might be happening underneath the surface. From the moment Caitlin Clark stepped into the league, it was obvious she didn't fit the usual rookie storyline. This wasn't a slow introduction or a cautious adjustment period. Her presence changed the environment instantly. Arenas that had struggled to fill seats suddenly had lines out the door. Road games started feeling like home crowds because fans weren't there for the jerseys, they were there for her. Ratings didn't just tick up, they spiked. Broadcasts led with her name. Highlights featuring Clark traveled farther and faster than anything else the league was putting out, and the numbers backed it up in a way no marketing pitch ever could. What separated Clark wasn't just her production, though that alone would have justified the attention. She wasn't padding stats in meaningless moments. She was controlling games, dictating pace, and forcing defenses to warp around her presence. Points, assists, gravity, she led in the metrics that actually translate to impact. But the bigger shift was happening off the scoreboard. Casual sports fans who had never followed the WNBA suddenly knew her schedule. People who couldn't name more than one team were arguing about her performances online. That kind of crossover appeal is rare, and it doesn't happen by accident. For the league, this should have been a dream scenario.
Every sports organization claims it wants growth, relevance, and cultural momentum. Caitlin Clark delivered all three at once. She pulled younger viewers, reignited lapsed fans, and brought mainstream sports media into conversations it had long ignored. Her games weren't just watched, they were anticipated. And anticipation is the most valuable currency in modern sports. You can't manufacture it with slogans or ad campaigns. It has to come from someone fans feel compelled to see. But here's where the story gets complicated. Caitlin Clark wasn't content to just exist inside the system. She had opinions. She spoke plainly. She didn't dress her answers in empty phrases or safe cliches. When asked about the game, the league, or the fan experience, she answered like someone who understood the moment she was in. That authenticity deepened her connection with audiences, but it also made her harder to manage. Influence that grows organically doesn't come with an off switch, and it doesn't always align neatly with institutional comfort.
Clark wasn't just becoming a star within the league structure. She was becoming bigger than it. Her reach extended beyond official channels, beyond press releases, beyond the narratives teams carefully curate. Fans listen to her, not just the league talking about her. And while that kind of power excites audiences, it can make decision-makers uneasy. Because once a player becomes the reason people show up, watch, and care, the balance of control starts to shift. That's why calling Caitlin Clark just another rookie never made sense. Rookies don't reshape audience behavior. They don't force national conversations. They don't become reference points for the future of a league within months. Clark did all of that without waiting for permission. And whether leadership was ready or not, she had already crossed an invisible line, from promising newcomer to central figure in the league's identity. And when that happens, the spotlight doesn't just get brighter, it gets heavier. Because the moment a player carries that much weight, every decision around them stops being simple. And the league was about to learn that the hard way. At first, nothing looked dramatic enough to spark outrage. The change was subtle, almost easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention. A slightly different rotation, fewer designed moments where the offense clearly ran through her. Broadcasts that mentioned her impact without lingering on it the way they had before. For casual viewers, it felt like a normal fluctuation. But for fans who had been tracking every game, every possession, something felt off. Then came the small details that didn't line up. Pre-game routines looked different. The rhythm she'd built with teammates seemed disrupted, not by chemistry issues, but by choice. Her minutes didn't always match her effectiveness. Situations where she normally would have been the clear option suddenly went another direction. These weren't basketball decisions that screamed incompetence. They were decisions that felt deliberate, and deliberate decisions invite scrutiny. Reporters noticed it too. Questions started creeping into post-game press conferences, carefully phrased at first, nothing accusatory, just clarifications. Why the shift? Was something being managed? Was there an injury fans didn't know about? The answers, however, didn't settle anything. They floated in that familiar gray space of professional sports language, non-committal, vague, carefully worded. The kind of responses that technically answer a question while revealing absolutely nothing. What raised eyebrows wasn't just what was said, but what wasn't. No timeline, no concrete explanation, no acknowledgement that anything unusual was happening at all. For a league that had been quick to highlight Clark's importance when it benefited them, the sudden reluctance to address her role felt strange, almost protective in the wrong way, like someone was trying to avoid starting a conversation they couldn't fully control. As the days passed, the inconsistencies became harder to dismiss. Her on-court influence didn't match her treatment, her numbers didn't justify the shift, and there was no visible incident, no argument caught on camera, no report of internal conflict that would logically explain the change. That disconnect is what kept the conversation alive. Fans weren't reacting to one decision, they were reacting to a pattern that refused to make sense. Online, the tone shifted from curiosity to concern.
Clips circulated comparing earlier games to recent ones. Screenshots of rotations, play calls, and substitutions piled up. People weren't trying to tear anything down, they were trying to understand. And the more they looked, the more it seemed like the explanation everyone expected simply didn't exist. That's when the speculation really began to take shape. Because in professional sports, when performance doesn't explain a decision and transparency doesn't fill the gap, people start wondering what's happening behind the curtain. And whether intentional or not, the league's silence was turning a quiet adjustment into a very loud question. Once it became clear that the usual explanations didn't apply, the conversation shifted into a different gear. Not publicly at first, but quietly in corners where sports stories often take their earliest shape. Fans, insiders, and media figures began trading theories, careful to frame them as speculation, but unable to ignore how consistently the same ideas kept resurfacing. When clarity disappears, people look for patterns, and more than a few people thought they were starting to see one. Rumors began circulating that the issue had nothing to do with basketball at all. Some reports claimed there was growing tension behind the scenes, not between Clark and her teammates, but between Clark and people higher up the decision-making ladder. The idea wasn't that she had crossed some official line, but that she had become inconvenient, too visible, too influential, too capable of shaping conversations without going through the league's usual filters. Again, none of this was confirmed, but the fact that the whispers all pointed in the same direction made them hard to dismiss entirely.
Another thread of speculation focused on messaging. It's been said that Clark's straightforward interviews and unpolished honesty didn't always align with the image the league wanted to present. She didn't rely on vague phrases or deflections. She spoke like someone who understood the fans were listening, and that kind of candor can make executives uncomfortable, especially when it resonates more than official statements do. According to some accounts, that disconnect created friction, not because she said anything outrageous, but because she didn't sound controlled. There was also quiet buzz around marketing strategy. A few reports claimed Clark had questioned how the league was positioning itself, suggesting that decision-makers were out of touch with the very audience she was helping bring in. If true, that would explain why the response felt so calculated. Challenging strategy behind closed doors isn't a violation of rules, but it can bruise egos. And in organizations built on hierarchy, bruised egos have a way of reshaping careers. None of these claims came with names attached. No official sources stepped forward. Everything lived in that uncomfortable middle ground where stories aren't proven, but they don't disappear either. And what made the speculation gain traction wasn't drama, it was logic. If performance wasn't the problem and health wasn't the issue, then the explanation had to exist somewhere else. Influence, control, narrative. Those were the words people kept circling back to. Importantly, not everyone believed the whispers. Some pushed back, arguing that fans were reading too much into routine decisions, and that skepticism mattered. It kept the conversation from tipping into conspiracy. But even the doubters acknowledged one thing. The league's refusal to clearly explain anything was fueling the noise. Every non-answer gave the rumors more oxygen. By this point, the story was no longer just about Caitlin Clark's minutes or role. It was about trust. Trust between fans and the league. Trust between players and leadership. And once that trust starts to wobble, even unverified whispers can feel heavier than official statements, because silence doesn't just leave room for speculation, it invites it. Up until this point, everything had lived in a gray zone. Fans speculated, media hinted, insiders whispered, but the conversation was still easy for leadership to ignore because it hadn't crossed one critical line yet. That line was players speaking publicly, and once that happened, the entire dynamic shifted in a way that couldn't be walked back. It didn't come from a polished press statement or a carefully timed social post. It came in real time, in front of microphones, with no buffer and no spin. A teammate broke ranks and said what so many had been thinking but were afraid to voice. Not angrily, not theatrically, just plainly. the kind of honesty that lands harder because it isn't dressed up. The message was simple. You don't quietly sideline the most influential player in the league unless something deeper is going on. That moment mattered because it shattered the idea that this was just a fan-driven narrative. Players see things fans don't. They live inside the systems everyone else is guessing about. So when one of them chose to speak, it reframed everything. This wasn't outsiders reading too much into rotations anymore. This was someone inside the locker room acknowledging that what was happening didn't feel normal. What made it even more powerful was the risk attached to it. Players understand the unspoken rules better than anyone. You don't challenge leadership publicly. You don't question decisions without consequences. Endorsements, minutes, opportunities, none of it is guaranteed when you step out of line. And everyone watching knew that, which is why the decision to speak carried weight beyond the words themselves. It wasn't just commentary, it was a choice. Once that door opened, it didn't stay open quietly. Clips spread fast, not because they were outrageous, but because they felt real. Fans latched on to the honesty. Media outlets that had been hesitant suddenly had something concrete to discuss. The narrative shifted from, "Is something going on?" to, "Why is a player willing to risk this to say it out loud?" And that question pointed straight back at the league. Soon after, another teammate added to the moment, not with accusations, but with a question that hit even harder. If this can happen to the player bringing in the most attention, what protection does anyone else really have? That wasn't a soundbite meant to trend. It was a reflection of a fear many players quietly live with, and hearing it spoken publicly changed how the entire situation was perceived. In that instant, this stopped being a story about Caitlin Clark alone. It became about player security, power dynamics, and whether influence is rewarded or punished in professional sports. The focus widened. Fans weren't just defending a star, they were questioning a system. And for the league, that was a far more dangerous conversation than any single controversy. Because once players start validating what fans are already sensing, control over the narrative slips fast, and the league was no longer dealing with speculation. It was dealing with something much harder to contain: credibility coming from inside its own walls. Once the conversation shifted from one player to many, the implications became impossible to ignore. This was no longer about whether Caitlin Clark deserved more minutes or clearer communication. It was about what her situation revealed for everyone else in the league. Because if a player with her visibility, impact, and public support could be handled this quietly, it raised an unsettling question. What happens to players without that kind of spotlight? Professional athletes understand power structures better than most fans ever will. They know which voices are protected and which ones are replaceable. They know how quickly opportunity can dry up without any official explanation. And they know that most consequences don't come in the form of public punishment. They come quietly. Fewer chances, shorter leashes, doors that stop opening without anyone ever saying why. That's the reality many players immediately connected to when they watched this unfold. For years, there has been an unspoken understanding inside the league. Do your job, don't rock the boat, and keep difficult conversations private if you want longevity. That rule doesn't appear in contracts, but it shapes careers just as much as performance does. And seeing a high-profile player potentially run into resistance for being influential forced everyone to reevaluate how real their own security actually was. Younger players in particular paid attention. Many of them entered the league believing things were changing, that authenticity was valued, that fan connection mattered, that the league wanted personalities as much as production. Clark represented that future. So when her situation became murky, it felt like a warning sign. Not a written one, but a visible one. A reminder that independence and influence don't always translate to protection. Veterans saw it differently, but just as clearly. Some recognized patterns they'd experienced before, moments when speaking honestly led to stalled careers, when being difficult mattered more than being effective, when survival meant silence.
For them, this wasn't shocking, it was familiar. What was different this time was the scale. The fact that it was happening in plain sight, with fans watching, made it harder to pretend it was just coincidence. This is where the tension really deepened, because the issue wasn't whether leadership had made a single questionable decision. It was whether the system itself was built to reward compliance over contribution, whether influence was encouraged only as long as it stayed manageable, and whether the league truly wanted players to be voices or just assets. As these questions spread, something subtle but important happened. Players started talking to each other more openly. Conversations moved off official channels. Trust lines shifted. The focus turned from "is this fair?" to "how do we protect ourselves if it isn't?" And once that mindset takes hold, the dynamic between a league and its players changes permanently. At that point, Caitlin Clark's situation had already served its purpose as a catalyst. It forced a collective realization that no amount of talent guarantees safety. And when players start understanding that together, silence stops being the default and starts feeling like a risk of its own. If the goal was to let the situation fade on its own, silence seemed like the safest option. No statement meant no headline. No explanation meant no quote to dissect. From a traditional PR perspective, saying nothing can feel like control. But in this case, it did the exact opposite. Because in today's sports landscape, silence doesn't pause the conversation, it hands it over to everyone else. Fans aren't passive anymore. They don't wait for official narratives to tell them how to feel. They analyze, clip, compare, and organize in real time. So when days passed without clarity, the gap was instantly filled. Every league post became a comment section interrogation. Every unrelated announcement was met with the same question repeated thousands of times. Not angrily at first, but persistently. And persistence is far more difficult to manage than outrage. The lack of response also made the situation feel intentional, even if it wasn't. When organizations address minor issues quickly, but avoid acknowledging major ones, people notice. It creates the impression that someone is choosing not to speak, not struggling to find the right words. And that perception matters. Because once fans believe information is being withheld, trust erodes fast, and rebuilding it takes far more than a late statement.
Media coverage followed the same pattern. Outlets that might have moved on were forced to stay engaged because there was nothing to resolve the story. Without an official explanation, every segment turned into analysis. Every discussion reopened the same questions. Silence didn't shrink the story, it stretched it. What could have been a short cycle became an ongoing narrative, fueled by uncertainty instead of facts. There was also a generational disconnect at play. Modern audiences expect transparency, even when the truth is uncomfortable. They don't need perfection, they need acknowledgement. By offering neither, the league appeared out of step with the very fans Caitlin Clark had helped bring in. Fans who were new, digitally native, and far less willing to accept no comment as an answer. Perhaps the biggest miscalculation was underestimating how quickly collective action forms online. What started as individual frustration turned into coordinated pressure. Fans tagged sponsors, they amplified player voices, they kept the topic alive across platforms in ways no single statement could counter. Silence, instead of diffusing the situation, gave those efforts a clear target. At a certain point, the conversation stopped being about whether the league was right or wrong. It became about why it wouldn't engage at all. And once that framing took hold, every hour without response felt less like strategy and more like confirmation that something was being avoided. In trying to maintain control, the league lost it. Because in an era where attention is shared and narratives are built collectively, refusing to speak doesn't preserve authority, it weakens it. And by the time leadership realized it, the story had already outgrown their ability to quietly contain it.
There's a moment in every controversy where things stop being reversible, where the conversation crosses from management into meaning. That moment came when players stopped speaking as individuals and started sounding like something closer to a united front. Not loud, not chaotic, just firm. The tone shifted from reaction to resolve, and once that happens, there's no returning to business as usual. What stood out wasn't anger, it was clarity. The language became simpler, more direct, almost impossible to misinterpret. This wasn't about one rotation change or one misunderstood decision. It was about respect, transparency, and the basic expectation that influence earned on the court shouldn't be quietly diminished off it. When players began framing it that way, the message landed differently. It wasn't emotional, it was principled. Public appearances mattered here. Sitting side by side, asking questions instead of issuing demands made the stance harder to dismiss. It signaled thought, not impulse. And the absence of backtracking was just as important as the words themselves. No softening, no taken out of context explanations. The line was drawn clearly, and everyone watching understood it. That clarity rippled fast. Locker rooms buzzed, group chats lit up. Players who had stayed silent before began acknowledging the moment, if only subtly. A like here, a repost there. Small gestures that collectively said the same thing. This wasn't going away. And because it came from within the league, it carried a weight that outside criticism never could. The broader sports world noticed too. Support from other athletes amplified the message and stripped away the idea that this was an isolated disagreement. It framed the situation as part of a larger conversation about player agency and institutional comfort. And once that framing sticks, it changes how every future decision is viewed. From that point on, there was no neutral ground left. Silence now looked like a choice. Engagement looked like accountability. Whatever leadership decided to do next would be interpreted through that lens. The story had evolved beyond damage control into a test of values. That's why this line can't be undrawn, because it isn't about walking anything back, it's about moving forward. And once players publicly signal they're done accepting ambiguity where clarity is owed, the relationship between a league and its stars enters a new phase, one where influence can't be quietly managed anymore, and where ignoring the moment only guarantees it will return, louder and harder to contain.
What made this moment different wasn't just the names involved or the attention it received, it was memory. Fans didn't move on. They didn't let the cycle reset. They didn't wait for the next highlight to replace the last uncomfortable question. Instead, they stayed with the story, tracked the shifts, noticed the patterns, and refused to treat silence as an answer. And in modern sports, that kind of attention is powerful. For years, leagues have relied on the idea that outrage fades and narratives reset, that if you wait long enough, something else will take its place. But Caitlin Clark's rise changed who was watching, and those fans engage differently. They don't just consume the product, they analyze it. They don't forget moments that feel off. And once they sense a disconnect between what they're told and what they're seeing, they don't stop asking questions just because the schedule moves on. This situation became bigger than a single player because it exposed how fragile trust really is. Trust between fans and the league, trust between players and leadership, trust that excellence will be supported, not managed into silence. Whether every rumor was accurate almost stopped mattering. What mattered was the response, or lack of one, and what it suggested about priorities behind the scenes. Caitlin Clark didn't need to say anything for this to resonate. Her presence alone was enough to trigger the conversation. And the players who spoke up didn't frame themselves as rebels, they framed themselves as witnesses. That distinction is important because it shifts the focus from conflict to accountability, from drama to expectation. Now the league stands at a crossroads, not because of one controversy, but because of what this moment revealed.
Fans are watching differently. Players are communicating differently. And the old assumption that silence equals control doesn't hold the same power it once did. Every future decision will be filtered through what happened here, whether acknowledged or not. So the real question isn't whether this story is over, it's whether leadership understands that it's being remembered. Because when fans stop forgetting, leagues don't just face criticism, they face change. And what happens next will say far more about the future of the game than any statement ever could.